it's kind of a simple concept, and it's used very often in social sciences, not only in archaeology and anthropology, but in sociology, I'm sure, too. So basically, there is kind of this conflict, you know, of structure versus individual. And by structure, I mean any kind of social rules or social norms or laws that could all be structure. So on the one hand, you know, we all need structure because otherwise there would be chaos, right? We need certain rules, like we need rules when we drive on the road, for example, right? If we don't set up any rules, cars will crash with each other and stuff like that. But then on the other hand, you also hear people always complain about the fact that these structures, they constrained their freedom, right? They're saying, man, I'm tired of all these rules, of all of the government, of the police, of all these social norms. I just want to be free. And so basically, on the one hand, we're sort of the victims of the structure, so to speak. But on the other hand, we are the ones that design those rules. So those rules, they're not designed by some aliens, right, that are imposing these rules on us. They're designed by people who are in the government, you know, and just the general public. They want these rules, they want these laws in place. So there's always this conflict. And basically, you know, for example, in your day-to-day life, you may hear a lot of people say, you know, well, what can I do? I'm just a screw in this huge system. I can't change anything. You know, I just live by these rules that already exist. I can't change the rules. I can't change the laws. But on the other hand, we see rules and laws constantly being changed, right? The political structure being changed. What's allowed, what's not allowed, that's being changed all of the time, right? And sometimes changed very drastically. So this is what this concept of agency is. You know, agency is basically the capacity of individual to break rules, to change rules, to manipulate rules, to negotiate their position in the society. That's all called agency. And you may hear phrases, you know, when you read different social science works, they did have agency or didn't have agency. That just means, you know, how much sort of individual freedom these people in that society had or have right now. This is kind of what agency constructing mausoleums, right? They call them mausoleums in on the island of Borneo, right? This Birawan culture, Birawan ethnicity. When someone dies, sometimes they construct these mausoleums, and you can see, you know, a picture here. And like you said, Tatiana, sometimes these mausoleums were constructed for, you said, nobodies, right? For nobodies, people who were not wealthy, who were not, you know, chiefs, who didn't occupy a very high status or prestige in that society. And what Parker Pearson is talking about, okay, you know, let's say there is a young aspiring individual. He wants to have a high status in that society. He wants to have a large amount of prestige. And one way to do that, to gain sort of the respect, to gain favor of your fellow community members, is to display how wealthy you are, how successful you are, how rich you are. And one way of doing that is to build a mausoleum for one of your relatives. When one of your relatives dies, you can build a mausoleum. You can organize a feast, maybe, where you feed everyone, maybe give people presents. And after you do that, in your community, you become known as this person, you know, as this person of high status, and people look at you as a leader. And so basically, there is this aspiring young leader but no one dies. You know, his mother, his father, his brothers and uncles, everyone is healthy. No one dies. So he doesn't have a reason, he doesn't have an excuse to do something like that. But he's itching, or she's itching, but in this case it was a he. He's itching to do something like that. So all of a sudden he hears that, you know, one of his very distant relatives dies, but that relative was a nobody. You know, maybe that relative was a poor person, not successful, not distinguished in any way. So he says, okay, here's my opportunity. So he takes this distant relative who is a nobody of a low status and buries that relative in a very fancy way and builds a huge mausoleum. They're usually built out of wood, builds a huge mausoleum for him or for her, and therefore kind of pushes his agenda forward and reaches his goals, right? So that's an example that Parker Pearson provides for us. So the second part of the question is, how is this related to, or what implications, what consequences does something like this have for archaeologists? You know, with archaeologists, how do people traditionally think? I excavate a burial, and this burial contains a lot of burial goods. There is a mausoleum built on top of it. So I necessarily think this person was a chief. This person was a person of high status. This person was rich. This person was like the man in this village. That's wrong in this particular example. We can't think like that, right? That's what Parker Pearson is trying to tell us, that sometimes we can't think in this direct, simple way, because individuals, they're very smart, they're very clever, they're very conniving, right? And sometimes things are not as straightforward, things are not as simple as in this Bornean case. I would be mistaken because this person is a nobody. But like Vlad said, at least it shows me that this kind of status competition is going on in this society. It is a big place. People are competing for power, whether these are the actual exact people that are buried in the grave or not. But this status competition for prestige, that's definitely going on in this society. So I can at least say that, okay? So that's an example of sort of this practice theory and agency thinking in the world of archaeology. And also, like I said, think back to the Johnson reading. What criteria of that agency sort of thinking do you see here in this article? Why is this like a prime example, a perfect example of agency archaeology? And Julia probably said a lot already about this, but maybe someone wants to add something. There are other parts that Julia hasn't mentioned. Okay, so let me comment on this then a little bit. So the first kind of a giveaway is this focus on the individual, you know, and Julia mentioned that these agency thinkers, they're interested in the role of the individual in all kinds of historical and prehistorical processes. And here is a prime example of them taking one individual and going through sort of his life. Also, another criteria of agency approaches is this focus on ordinary people, sort of your everyday, your average Joes. And this person was kind of ordinary, right? He wasn't a chief, he wasn't a king, he wasn't the most special person in that community. Like, you know, he was a worker, he had a craft, he ate a diet that was similar to everyone else's diet. So, you know, they hint at the fact that he may have been special due to his 6 toes. Maybe he was treated a little bit differently, or may have occupied like some kind of a special status in the community, but we don't know that. There isn't very strong evidence to support that. So overall, he was an ordinary and average person. And that's what these agency archaeologists love to look at, these ordinary individuals. You know, what did they do? How did they react to different scenarios, to different events? Also, you know, this illustrates individual choices. You know, when we talked about agency, we talked about people's decision-making, people's strategies. So for example, here they are talking about a lot of people already abandoned the village before the village was sacked. You know, they do mention that. And it looks like Block 100 men decided to stay because, you know, things were bad. People were on the brink of starvation. There was already violence going on. So a lot of people were migrating out to the neighboring regions. But at the last stand, they said there was a small part of the community that stayed. They said maybe it was people who couldn't walk, who were immobilized. They even mentioned like maybe it was some mentally challenged people, maybe some old people, invalids. You know, a group of people for some reason decided to stay. They didn't migrate out of the region. They decided to stay and give this sort of a last fight. They hoped for the best, and it didn't work out for them. And this Block 100 man was one of the people who stayed, and apparently a bunch of his relatives too, because when they're talking about these abnormalities, the non-metric traits, they find them on the Block 100 man and also on other corpses, essentially, that were found in the village, in different blocks of the village. So looks like it was a group, you know, that had kinship ties, maybe like a clan, a large family. They decided to stay, and they didn't want to leave their homes. So that gives you, you know, a door, a way into looking at, like I said, individual decisions versus looking at these broad processes, like what the authors say. I believe they call them sweeping normative reconstructions of social change. They said, we're not looking at sweeping normative reconstructions of social change. An example of that would be, okay, like there was a drought and everyone is doing A, B, and C, or there was a violence or the village was attacked and everyone is doing A, B, and C. What's the normal thing to do when there is a drought in the region? And what's a normal thing to do in these circumstances? And this article basically shows there is no such thing as the normal thing. For every individual, what's normal is different. Like for the Block 100 man, it's normal to stay. And for a lot of his other community members, it's normal to leave. You know, so Block 100 man reacts to this great drought in one way, other people react to it in another way. So we can't really talk about this kind of a unified approach to what all people do, what the entire community does. Because like a normative scenario would be, okay, there's a drought in the region, there's violence going on, this village is sort of going slowly but surely to its demise. Normal people will migrate out and go to another region and start a village there. But some people do that, other people don't do that. And you can only kind of get the broader, the better picture, the more full picture by employing this kind of an individual agency approach. So this is what they're doing here, and that's why this is an example of agency type of archaeology, mainly because of the stress on the individual. And also, like Julia mentioned, you know, conflict, but I think that's not the type of a conflict that agency archaeologists like to look at. This is warfare. So warfare is a pretty, you know, kind of a normal mechanism, and agency archaeologists like to look at social conflict, not at warfare type of conflict, not at violence. They like to look at the conflict between sort of genders or between different social strata. So even though there's a conflict here, it's not really, it doesn't really directly relate to the agency aspect of this reading.